Finally, over 10 years after release, we have finally figured out how to solve the worst minigame in Wind Waker thanks to reverse engineering. Now, how is this even possible? How does this work? And most importantly, why is this important to begin with? Well, I'm going to break down all of that in today's video. But first, before we get into the actual details of how the RNG works in this video game, I'm going to break down what Sploosh Kaboom actually is. So, if you don't know, Sploosh Kaboom is a minigame that can be found in the center of Windfall Island, and it's being played by a character named as the Salvatore, and the Salvatore has a bunch of minigames spread out throughout Wind Waker itself. Now, this specific version of Battleship uses squids, 3 squids to be exact, a 4 squid, a 3 squid, and a 2 squid. Now, you have 24 shots to find these 3 squids over an 8x8 grid. There is a total of 3 rewards that you will obtain from defeating these 3 squids. You will get 1 for beating the game the first time, a second one for beating it a second time, and then 1 time if you're able to beat his high score, which is 20, so 19 or below. Now, why is this bad? Well, even if you're able to shoot the statistical best shots possible, you have a very low likelihood of being able to beat this due to the limited amount of shots that the game provides. And on top of that as well, especially in a speedrun, you want to spend as few attempts here as possible, and this is 30 minutes in. So in average, with how long we can sacrifice time in a speedrun, that meant that only about 1/4 of all runs actually got past this point, meaning that we basically spent 2 hours to get a single attempt going, which wasn't the most fun, and definitely ended up a lot of resets. Now, how do we go from this to actually reverse engineering this? Well, I think the first thing we need to break down is basically giving you a broad understanding about how RNG is being generated in Wind Waker itself. And I'm actually going to get a friend by the name of C Sunday in the video, and he's going to help me explain exactly how Wind Waker generates its RNG.
The key discovery we made was that Wind Waker uses the Weichmann Hill pseudo-random number generator and always starts with a fixed seed. Weichmann Hill starts with 3 numbers that we call the RNG state values. Each time the generator is called, the state numbers are changed and a random number is produced. The state changes follow a predictable pattern based on multiplying and dividing prime numbers. These values keep changing and more random numbers are produced until the RNG's period is exhausted, and Weichmann Hill has a period of about 7 trillion values before repeating. Now normally, software that uses a random number generator like this will start with unpredictable state values, often based on the current time. We call these starting values the RNG's seed, since they determine all the random numbers the RNG will produce. In Wind Waker's case, however, we found that the console always uses a seed of 3 100s during the boot-up process and never resets this seed. With this in hand, we can predict every RNG value that Wind Waker will ever use, and the game will always receive the same sequence of random numbers from the Weichmann Hill generator. Since the squid positions in Sploosh Kaboom are based on these random numbers, we can calculate what squid positions you would get for each point in the RNG's period. Now, just knowing what RNG values Wind Waker will use, and the boards we get for each one, isn't enough to solve Sploosh Kaboom. During normal gameplay, the RNG function is being called dozens of times per frame, and the number of calls depends on what's on screen, what the player is doing, and so on. For example, in the Sploosh Kaboom room, we know each rupee behind the board causes 1 RNG call per frame, Link and Salvatore cause 1 RNG call per frame each, and the board lighting causes 2 calls per frame. So by the time a run gets to Sploosh Kaboom about 30 minutes in, there's no real way to know where we are in the RNG cycle.
At this point, we had finally figured out exactly how the RNG was working, how the RNG is being generated, and we had made great progress. However, there's one problem. As you can see towards the end of the video with Sunday, there is one major issue, and that is how many calls per frame that RNG is making. For example, 20 times, 100 times per frame. How could we possibly manipulate RNG in this way? Well, we actually don't need to manipulate RNG, because since the order will always be the same, we don't have to manipulate it. We just have to figure out where we are in the RNG cycles. And that's where this new tool that was being developed comes into an effect. Now, this is a much more advanced part, and I'm gonna let Peter, the main developer of this tool, exactly explain how this knowledge was taken into consideration for developing this app that we're currently using to this day.
Okay, you see the tool in action. Let's explain how it works. So there are about 604,000 possible squid layouts, and it turns out that the game generates all of them with approximately equal probability. But let's say we magically knew that only a handful of squid layouts were possible, say these 12 boards. We'll call them our candidate boards. What we can do is generate a heat map of where squids are likely to be from our candidate boards. Let's start by ignoring which squids are which and only pay attention to which cells actually contain squids. So here I've produced a heat map for each board individually. Then we can average these heat maps together to produce an overall heat map. So this percentage in each cell says the percentage of boards that contain a squid in that location. And because we assume that all these boards are equally likely, that's therefore also the probability of finding a squid in that given cell. So here we average all of these boards together, and when we're done, we're going to find that this one particular cell right here has a 58% chance of containing a squid. So let's say the user fires on that cell and gets a miss. Well, then what we can do is we can rule out every board that contains a squid in that location, which happens to be these. Now that we've ruled out these boards as impossible, we can actually generate a new heat map by averaging the remaining boards. So here we can see that happening. And once we've done that, we now know that this cell right here has a 60% chance of containing a squid. Let's say that the user fires on that cell and gets a hit this time. Now we can rule out any board that does not contain a squid in that location, which would be these two. And again, we can compute a new heat map that's compatible with the information we now have. We then can fire on this cell. Let's say we get a hit. We can rule out this board because it does not contain a squid there. We now have 2 boards left. And at this point we can fire on any of these 50-50 cells. Let's say we fire here and get a miss. We can rule out this board, and now we know exactly what the squid layout is. And now the user is free to shoot the remaining squids as quickly as they can. So it's clear that the name of the game is limiting the set of possible boards. But how can we do that? Well, in order to do that, we're going to need to understand the RNG. As was mentioned before, the Wind Waker uses a fixed seed for its RNG. So in particular, the first random number it generates will always be this 0.69 number. And in fact, these will always be the first 10 random numbers it generates. So what do these random numbers get used for? And which ones will get used to generate the Sploosh Kaboom board? Well, it turns out that we can't quite know immediately. This isn't enough information. We actually need to know what's going on in all of the various frames of the game. Let's say the first frame of the game called for 3 random numbers, shown here as these 3. Well, it turns out the next frame of the game could actually call for 4 random numbers. Let's say another object comes into view. So now in addition to those 3 calls, we also need to do an extra call for the lighting of that object, and so on. Every frame of the game can use a variable number of calls depending on what's going on, as few as 0 and as many hundreds. So based on this, it's actually even more precise than frame perfect to manipulate which RNG value is used to generate the board. Let's give a simple example. I'll put all the possible RNG step values across the top of the screen here. And then I'm going to show which RNG values are consumed by which frames. So let's say the first frame of the game consumes these first 13 RNG values. If magically we were to teleport to Sploosh Kaboom on the second frame of the game, then we would actually get this board shown right here. And in fact, generating that board would itself consume some random numbers shown here. But if we had shown up to Sploosh Kaboom just a single frame later, then we actually would have gotten a totally different board. Frame after that, another board. Frame after that, another board. And okay, so far this just sounds frame perfect, but as I said before, it's worse than that. If there had been a little bit more going on in frame 4, then maybe it would have called for a few more random numbers, and we would have used even yet a different board. So you can't even just do like a frame perfect setup, resetting the game to get it to that 100, 100, 100 RNG state, and then getting to Sploosh Kaboom in some particular number of frames. No, it's much more precise than that. But you might be thinking, okay, we don't need to know exactly when we're showing up to Sploosh Kaboom. As we said earlier, we only need to be able to have a limited set of possibilities for the board. So let's zoom in on how we might do that. Let's say we, instead of just having a specific RNG value that we want to show up to Sploosh Kaboom at, we're going to have a range of possible RNG values and a probability distribution over them. We're going to show that on the y-axis here with a probability distribution. So let's look at what board we would get if we showed up to Sploosh Kaboom at each of these RNG step counts. Here we can see that for every RNG step count, you just get a completely different board. It's not like if you show up at RNG step count 15, you get a board that's similar to this board you would get if you showed up at 14 steps. So given all these boards, maybe we think that we're going to show up to Sploosh Kaboom around RNG step 15. Could be less, could be more, could be as little as 10, as much as 20, probably not anything outside of that region. Then we can do exactly what we showed before of making a heat map, and this time we're going to take a weighted average of all of the boards under this bell curve. So first we're going to convert each board into its own heat map by ignoring where the squids are, and then we're going to average together all the heat maps under the bell curve. Okay, this sounds great so far. You might think we're in business. All we have to do is show up to Sploosh Kaboom at plus or minus, say, 100 or 1,000 RNG steps, and then we can produce a heat map like this and do the process shown before to try to beat Sploosh Kaboom. Well, it turns out to be a bit worse than that. We don't just show up to Sploosh Kaboom at like 1,000 RNG steps. We don't even show up to it in like 10,000 or 100,000 RNG steps. Top runners on world record pace typically show up to Sploosh Kaboom at around 5.5 million steps, shown here. Let's zoom in on this bell curve. So it turns out that for a typical bell curve for when top runners might show up to Sploosh Kaboom, there aren't just hundreds or thousands of boards. There are literally hundreds of thousands of boards that are possible. And if we were to do that same averaging process I showed before across all these boards, we would get a heat map that looks more like this. It would be basically flat. Sure, the corners are a little bit less likely because it's harder for a squid to fit in there, but this is basically just the information that you would get without any knowledge about the RNG. So this is clearly not going to work. We have to do something a little bit more sophisticated. So let's zoom in on what that more sophisticated thing is. In order to explain this, I'm going to go through a video of Linkus actually using the tool. I'm going to apologize in advance. This is going to be the most complicated part of the video. In order to try to make it a little bit easier to understand, I'm going to put a timeline along the bottom of the screen. All the way at the left of this timeline will be that critical moment when the game starts and we initialize the RNG to 100, 100, 100. I'm also going to put a little red cursor on the timeline that should correspond to where we are in the video. This video is already about 29 minutes into the run, right before Linkus gets to Sploosh Kaboom, so let's catch the red cursor up with the video. Okay, I'm going to start the video playing and we can see what happens. First, Linkus is going to item slide to the Sploosh Kaboom door, open it, the screen is going to fade to black, and I'll pause the video. So it turns out, right as the screen fades to black, entering the Sploosh Kaboom room is when the game generates the first board using the RNG. This is an extremely important moment, so let's mark it on our timeline. I'm now going to start the video playing again, and we're going to see Linkus play on this first board. So first he talks, starts the game, and Linkus is actually just going to throw this first board, shooting in totally arbitrary places, just to learn where the squids are. Okay, I paused the video again. This is a key moment. Linkus is about to press A to exit out of the board after having completed it, and that turns out to be the exact moment that it generates the next board. I know this sounds a bit weird. You might expect it to generate the next board at some point in the dialogue, but no, it actually generates it at this moment. This is also very important, so let's mark it on our timeline. Okay, I'm going to start the video playing again. Let's see what happens. Linkus talks to start another game, and then gets into the board. Okay, so this is the first game we would actually like to help Linkus win. Do we have enough information? Let's think about the information we have. I'm going to put Linkus in the top right corner. And let's draw that axis we had before for RNG steps against probability. So we know that Linkus probably showed up to Sploosh Kaboom and the first board was generated at around 5.5 million steps. That's just because that's typically when world record pace runners do. In particular, note that this 5.5 million number comes from the duration between when the game started and the first board was generated, shown here on the timeline. In addition, there's some variability in when Linkus shows up, So that's going to be indicated by this bell curve of our belief. Linkus could have shown up at plus or minus, say, a few 100,000 steps. Additionally, we also know the first board that was generated, and that's this board right here. And also, we know that certain RNG step counts will generate certain boards, so this first board was only possible at some subset of the possible RNG step counts. Let's say, for the sake of argument, it was only possible at these 4 step count amounts. So the leftmost match and the rightmost match seem extremely unlikely given our bell curve of when we think Linkus showed up to Sploosh Kaboom. So let's just disregard those completely. We're left with these 2 matches, and we can actually estimate their relative probability from this bell curve. So in particular, we think that this left match, which occurs at about 5,389,276 steps, is about 30% likely, whereas the other match is about 70% likely. So, to reiterate, these 2 candidate RNG step counts are the only possibilities for when the first board could have been generated, and these are their relative probabilities. Additionally, we know the amount of time between when the first board was generated and the second was generated, shown here on the timeline. As was mentioned earlier, in the Sploosh Kaboom room, the game uses about 8 RNG calls per frame, so from this amount of time we can extrapolate a pretty good estimate for how many RNG steps occurred between the first board being generated and the second board being generated. Putting all of this information together, we can produce an updated probability distribution for the RNG step count at which the second board was generated. This updates our one big bell curve into 2 little bell curves. Each of these spikes is actually a little bell curve with much narrower variance, and there are 2 spikes because we're not sure yet at which of the 2 candidate step counts the first board was generated. To emphasize the point, if the time between the second board generation and the first board generation had been a little bit higher, then we would instead estimate the spikes a little bit further to the right. But this is what we actually have. Given this probability distribution, we can do the whole heat map averaging process from before to help Linkus beat this board. Let's take a look at the video. So I'm going to play it now. It goes by fast, but watch how quickly the heat map, shown in the bottom left, narrows down on the actual board as Linkus takes shots. After just a handful of shots, the tool actually knows the exact board layout. So here we're also going to see Linkus intentionally shoot a bunch of misses because Sploosh Kaboom gives bonus rupees for beating your own record, so he's intentionally trying to make his record easier to beat on the next board. Okay, let's make this small again. So we're about to press A to exit out of this second board, and note that that's exactly the moment at which it generates the third board, same as before, so let's mark that on our timeline. Now, we also now know the second board, so let's update our knowledge here. Of course, the second board itself can also only occur at certain specific RNG step counts. Let's take a look at what those are. Here we have 3 possibilities. Now, the leftmost and rightmost don't occur inside of our bell curve at all, so we can just completely ignore them. I think it's also really important to note here that we've just learned something very interesting. So, this second board only occurs in the right bell curve spike, not in the left bell curve spike. So that means that we actually now know when the first board was generated. It was actually the 68.4% likely candidate, the one corresponding to the right spike. Let's update our knowledge of that. So now we actually know exactly when the first board was generated and when the second board was generated. Additionally, we know the amount of time between when the second board was generated and when the third board was generated, shown here on the timeline. So of course, we can do the exact same thing we did before. We can extrapolate the number of RNG steps between the second board generation and third board generation, and update our belief a second time. Now note that we only have a single bell curve spike because we know exactly when the second board was generated. Let's make the video big again, and here we can watch Linkus play using the heat map information from this probability distribution. So first we get some rewards from beating the second board, and another reward. Now Linkus talks to start the next game. And watch how quickly it figures out exactly what board we're on. So first we get a single miss, then we get a couple of hits, and already it knows it to within a pretty small set. A few more hits, we know it within 1 or 2, and now we know the exact board, and we win. And that's how the tool works.
Now, after this incredible breakdown from C Sunday and Peter going over how we figured out how the RNG worked, how this program works, and everything, you might be asking yourself, how is this even allowed in a speedrun? Well, I'm happy to say that we actually had a community vote if this should be allowed, and it won by a 2-3 majority of this program being allowed in official speedruns. Now, I want to clarify a couple of questions that some people might have if you either want to try and use this to yourself or just in general, why this is even allowed in the first place. First of all, is this available for anyone? Yes, absolutely. It's publicly available on a website. Anyone can access this. I will link it in the description of this video so anyone can try this out for themselves. Second of all, how is the program even knowing where you have shot, if it was a hit or miss, or if a squid has been killed? So, a lot of people think that it's taking basically memory addresses from the game console by using Homebrew or from using a screen capturing tool, but it's using none of that. It's actually all done completely manual, and this is the only reason it is allowed to begin with, is because everything is done manual. Now, you might be asking yourself, wait, but how did the program update so quickly? Well, it's basically just a lot of practice. I basically hold my controller with one hand, and then I put my other hand on the keyboard. So I'm one-handing it, so I'm shooting, and then I'm using my actual fingers on my keyboard to hotkey on hit, miss, or killed squid, so that I can much quicker actually input if they were hits or misses. So that's basically how you get down the speed to make it still fast in the speedrun. You basically have practice to one-hand the controller, but obviously you can do it two-handed, it's just slightly slower. You might also be asking yourself, what versions does this work on? And I'm happy to say that this will work on every version of the game now. This will work on every GameCube release of the game and every single Wii U release of the game, HD and GameCube. So any version can use this, anyone can use this program. It's absolutely amazing. I also want to say quickly that I think that everyone that came together here to actually make this possible deserves a huge shout. I'm going to put a list up on the screen now of every single person that helped with this. And that includes everyone like Peter, Kreis, Ginkgo, Trog, Lang, C Sunday, Shout, Max, the beautiful people at the NSA that developed a tool that we were actually able to use to actually decompile the code of the game, the beautiful developers of Dolphin that made this possible, and the people that developed the memory engine to read memory values while the game was running. Everyone that came together to make this thing possible, thank you guys so much. This would have not been possible without everyone else, and I want to make it very clear that this was a huge community effort, and this could not have been done by a single person. So huge shout out to everyone that came together for this. Now, I quickly want to show you guys a clip of the result of all this hard work. So enjoy this clip quickly. I messed up, whatever. Okay, I think I'm gonna lose this game. Now, with all of that being said, this is where I'm going to end this video. If you want to see more breakdowns of glitches or RNG in general, feel free to leave a comment down below suggesting what we might break down in the future, because I really enjoyed making this video. It took a lot of time, but I think that it ended up doing very well, and I think that in general, having the visuals to better understand these more complex things could definitely work as a format for the future. So feel free to leave any comments down below, giving me advice or tips, or in general your suggestions for what I might actually make a video on in the future, and I'll definitely take a look at that. But either way, thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel, and if you want to watch all of these speedruns alive of Wind Waker HD with this tool in action, you can obviously check out my Twitch channel at twitch.tv/Linkus7. But without further ado, thank you guys so much for watching. I love y'all tons, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Later, everybody!